In the previous chapters, we have defined functions in Python and we have seen what a docstring does. Now, we are going to look at arguments. What is an argument? Well, these are arguments, the instructions that you pass along to the function, or the parameters that are required by the function to do what it's asked to do. In this case, this function calculate interest requires three parameters: balance, interest, and the number of days. Now, there are some variations in which this function can be used. For example, what if you want to default the interest to say 4% all the time? Well, if the user has a different percentage rate, he can provide it. If not, it's always 4%. Or if you don't pass the number of days, calculate it from the beginning of the year, from January 1st. So these are some variations with which you can play around when you create or use functions. So how do you program your function to work accordingly? Let's see. First is the required argument, meaning these are mandatory arguments. Without them, you can't use the function. Now, when you define a function like this, calculate underscore interest, and then you want to calculate the interest without passing the number of days, say. You just pass two arguments. What happens? Oops, it does not work. It says missing one required positional argument, days. So when you specify a function like this, 1, 2, 3, 3, any number of parameters, it means that all those parameters are mandatory. It's not optional to send each of these parameters. You have to send all the parameters. Well, also, what about the order of sending these parameters? You see, the first parameter has got to be the balance, because that's how this function has been created. The second parameter would be the interest. The third parameter would be days. Now, can you play around with the order? Meaning, can you say 1004 is the interest and 100 is the number of days, right? Can you interchange this, like balance, days is 1, interest is 4, balance is 1000? Well, you could do it, but it gives you the wrong result, because 1 is the first parameter and it's always balance. You cannot interchange the order in which you send those parameters. Also, like I said, there's no way you can not specify the argument value, right? You have to always specify the argument value. But what if the interest rate is always 4%? Well, you could use the function to calculate interest at whatever rate you like, but by default, the interest is 4%. Now, I made the change. Oh, I got to put it at the very end. Control Z. Okay. Now, I can say the balance is $1,000 and the number of days is 100. Execute. I'm not providing the interest rate, you see. If I execute this, it gives me 10.95, which is the correct value. Interest rate in this case is by default 4%, because that's how the function has been defined. That does not mean that you cannot calculate function for a different interest rate. You can always say interest is 5%, in which case it will compute the interest amount at 5%, the new interest value, which is 13.69. There is an interesting side effect to this. Say, for example, you say balance equals $1,000. That's the default value. Days equals 100 days. Interest equals 4. Execute this. Now, of course, you don't have to give any parameters, and it will default it to the values that the function has provided. The side effect here is you can say interest equals 5%. Days equals 200, balance is 2000. See, it still works. although you have interchanged the way the parameters are there, like so, interest is first parameter, balance is the second parameter, days is the third parameter, it still works. That's because if you specify the default parameter, then it makes defining and using the function a bit more interesting. In data science, this is used quite a lot because functions and the logic inside the function can be so complex that you want to make the life of the user of that function a little bit easier. So you provide default values. And because of that, you can interchange the way these parameters can be used. Now, when I mean interchange, just the position, not the value, of course. A good example of using these default parameters is actually the print function. For example, how do you use a print function? You just say print Ajay, right? You just give print string or a number of strings. This is the actual definition of the function. This is how the function is actually defined in Python. Just the definition, not the actual implementation. Now this refers to the strings. You can pass in any number of strings. And this refers to the separator. When you pass in two strings, how should they be separated? And at the end of all the strings, should we go to a new line or not? And where should it be printed? On the console or at the error stream? So on and so forth. Let's use a couple of these parameters to change the way the print function works. This is a good example. When you say print Ajay in the first line and print tech in the second line, it automatically prints in the second line because every print statement puts a /n at the end. That's the default. Now we can change it to /n to a blank, in which case you see the first statement has printed Ajay and the second statement has printed tech, and in between there's no new line character. It's just nothing, just an empty string, right? If you were not doing that, this is how it would print. First statement, second statement, and between that there will be a new line. /n stands for a new line. Now another variation is the variable number of arguments. Now remember the print statement? A print statement can have n number of arguments. First string, second string, third string, fourth string, fifth strings. There are 6 strings here in this print statement. And you don't know how many strings the user is going to give. It's a variable number. In which case, how can you define that function? The way to do that is by using star just before the variable name begins. Now here is a good example, average grades. Now you want to calculate the average of grades, and the number of grades in a class is variable, meaning there could be 10 students in a class, 100 students in a class. Irrespective, you want to be able to calculate the average of the grades. How do you do that? Well, without using lists or any of those structures, you can use a simple star grades, where when you mention the star, it could mean variable number of arguments. Let's actually try it out. And then if you say grades, the user can only provide one grade, right? But if you say star grades, the user can provide any number of grades. Now these are available inside the function as an iterator. So you can say for grade in grades print, which is going to print out the grade. Okay? You could use anything. You can calculate the average, you can calculate the mean, the median, any of that stuff. I just want to show a point. Let's execute this. Okay. Now let's see how we can use this function. Average grades of 3.4. Right? Okay, that works. Let's say 3.4 and 4.0. There are 2 grades. That works too. Right? So you can pass any number of parameters, 3, 4, 500. The standard built-in function in Python, the print statement, also works similarly. Right? So you have a print Ajay, that works. and then if you say Ajay, comma, tech, that works too. And then you can have as many number of strings. So that's how you can send a variable number of arguments to a string. Now internally, Python takes these parameters as tuples. Now we have not seen tuples yet. In the data structure section, we'll talk about tuples.